I'd like to talk about habits today. Habits are patterns of behavior that give us some sort of pleasure or make our lives more comfortable. And they're habits of behavior. We sometimes talk about good habits and bad habits. But my father used to say habit rules the world, because a lot of what we do is habit. That is the pattern of our life, because we just don't have the time to think about everything. We don't have the time to think about exactly how we're going to butter the toast this time. So we butter it the same way we always do. We're not going to have always the time to figure out exactly what we want for breakfast this time, so we're going to have 2 slices of raisin toast with just a little bit of butter. Or the breakfast biscuits. If I don't have time for the toast, it's the package of don't hate me, it's a package of breakfast biscuits that I eat for breakfast. And it's one of those 2 things pretty much every morning. But if it wasn't for that, every morning I'd have to wake up and do I want eggs? How do I like them? Would I like the eggs? Maybe with a little... So habit is this thing that drives our lives almost unconsciously a lot of the time. And John the Baptist talked about changing what was normal behavior for some. Some of this had slipped into sort of self-serving habits. But it's a little bit difficult to talk about these. It's a little bit difficult to talk about the soldiers and how they were acting. A little bit difficult to talk about any of our habits, because we may not even know that we're doing it. It may have gotten to that point. Like which foot you put your sock on first. Now you're trying to remember which foot you put your sock on first, and you're having trouble, because it's a kind of habit that we don't really remember, and yet I venture to say we put it on the same way every time. Or exactly when you stop looking at someone, there's someone walking towards you on the street, and pretty much scientists have shown that within about 2 feet, your eyes are going to look down. You're going to have eye contact with them until a certain point, and then by habit, you will stop having eye contact with them for fear, I don't know, but you will stop having eye contact. You'll look down or to the side as a habit. Janice Ian, a great singer-songwriter, wrote a song called Silly Habits Mean a Lot about a couple breaking up, and she writes in her lyrics, I used to say I love you. She wrote, I used to say I love you, but one day I forgot. Silly habits mean a lot. So these are people that John is dealing with that had just gotten into certain sorts of habits. They weren't bad people. You know, these were just tax collectors. These were soldiers. These were ordinary people. They had just started making ordinary sorts of compromises, common compromises that, maybe everyone just grew to say, well, that's the way it goes. You're there, you do that, that's how you work. You get elected to serve in Albany, and that's just what happens, for instance. That's just sort of, how it operates. And tax collectors apparently made compromises on both ends. Soldiers made a bit of a living out of bullying because maybe they weren't paid enough, and they would bully somebody and say, if you want protection, a little protection racket going on the side. And the tax collectors, well, who likes taxes? And so if it's going to be bad, let's just make it a little bit worse. Nobody feels great about paying their taxes. I think we ought to change that, but taxes have always been controversial. Guy wrote into the IRS, said, Dear IRS, last year I cheated on my taxes, and I feel guilty and I can't sleep thinking about it. I'm therefore enclosing a check for $5,000. If I find that I still can't sleep, I will send the balance. So we all have these patterns that we've fallen into, these little sort of ways of doing things that may not be noble or good or kind, but they just become the habits of our life. It's just the way we do it. It's just how tax collectors were. It's just how soldiers were. It's just how accountants are, or whatever. I'm not picking on accountants today. But I'm going to play John the Baptist this morning and talk about what to do to get ready for the coming of God in the same way. Because you see, John was talking about the arrival of God, and people were going, what should we do? And then he got way specific, much too meddling. He said, well, you want to get ready for God? You got to stop doing that. And people are going, oh, I'm not sure I would have asked. I'm not sure I should have asked. You notice there's no follow-up to the story. There's no end of the story that says, and so all the soldiers stopped doing what they were doing. And tax collectors, they were all fabulous. No, we don't hear that part. So I'm going to play John the Baptist and take some of these principles and see what trouble I can get in, and hopefully not end up like John the Baptist did. The first thing I want to suggest to everyone is that we don't charge as much as we can. Really, he's going to talk about how we price things? Yes, I am. Because John the Baptist was very specific about what he wanted people to do. So in the same sort of fashion, I'm going to talk about how our selfishness gets enacted in economic sorts of ways. And the first thing we sort of have to get used to is the fact that some of us are going to be in a position to figure out what things cost, and that we shouldn't charge simply as much as we can. The tax collectors had a monopoly on their role. They could have done whatever they wanted. Which brings us to pharmaceuticals. 32-year-old Martin Shkreli bought a company that had, you know the story, bought this company that had an exclusive license on this particular AIDS medication called Daraprim, and he bought it, and then it was about $17 a pill, which frankly strikes me as a lot. That was the price at the beginning. And then he bought it and raised the price 5,000% immediately after purchasing. And then a hue and cry went up in the world, and he said okay, I'll lower the price. Well, then he didn't, actually. It's common practice to buy companies, fire people, cut wages, to make a short-term profit, and then to sell the company when things look good. And the hidden value here in all of this in America is that the market forces are holy, and that the common good is outweighed by individual rights of ownership. And we've seen in America that you can go too far with that, and it needs some sort of balance. And I'm not going to get into exactly what kind of balance there needs to be, but it's clear that John called people into a certain sort of understanding of the common good. If you have two things, give one away. If you have some food, share. If you don't exploit people, don't bully them. Union Presbyterian Church used to have a rummage sale, and I think they're glad not to do that again, but they came to us and they had this rich experience of having a rummage sale every year. And they would, as a part of the rummage sale, have people with special coupons who got sort of to take what they wanted for free, or was it highly discounted? It was free. It was free. You got a thing, and you didn't care if they paid you, right? Because they came in and they needed stuff, and that was a part of their heritage and history. So I guess someday we're going to be in a position to figure out what something costs. And I'm encouraging us to think of the common good. Now, all of this only works if we're willing to spend money on stuff. All of it only works, the market says, if you're willing to pay a 5,000% increase. Which brings us to my second suggestion for us as individuals in a society, is that not to spend as much as you can. Don't spend as much as you can possibly spend. Don't max out your credit cards. We live in a credit-driven society, and the habits of buying expensive things on credit is a part of the habit of our society. We are expected to buy a house. We are expected to buy pretty much as much of a house as we can, which is led to certain sorts of problems. We're expected to buy a car. We're expected, just the basic sort of understandings of the habits, the economic habits of our life together, are that we are expected to make major purchases that we end up paying for over time for credit. So credit becomes a way of how we measure ourselves, and that we are always in debt. We read about the company stores and how they would hire people and then charge them, and they would have to stay employed to pay off the debt to the company store. But in fact, that's how we live our lives. We have mortgages and car payments, and we find ourselves in situations that we sometimes can't really get out of because we have to do what we have to do. Cable television's a necessity, cell phone's a necessity, cars are necessities. And we have developed these habits quite innocently over time, these habits that have come to rule our lives. And John the Baptist says these habits have trapped us. And it's easy to spot the ones that are egregious, but that these habits have trapped us in a fashion that doesn't allow God to get in much anymore. Trapped in a world where we have to work 80 hours a week, a world in which there's no possible Sabbath. So I have some suggestions. I don't mean to burden us with all of these sorts of burdens about how we need to change without some degree of help in this matter. So I would like to talk about New Year's resolutions now, to prepare for the habits that we're going to change, so that we can all get ready for the New Year's resolution, because by the time January 1st rolls around, we're too exhausted to do much of any real imagining or thinking. So now is the time to talk about how we're going to change our habits in the future. Last year, however, I asked, I think in the middle of January, if anyone ever lived up to any of the resolutions they ever made. You remember that? One person in the back said that they had. It was a little discouraging, but we're going to talk about planning our habits for just a second. The first thing that it's clear that we need to do is to measure ourselves, that we need to keep track of what's going on. You know, if you wear a pedometer, you'll walk 27% more. Yeah. All you have to do is wear a pedometer, and scientists will tell you that you will walk more, because you're going to go, no, I didn't walk as much as yesterday. I think I'll walk. All you have to do is measure yourself in some way, and you will walk 27% more if you have a little gadget that somehow, measures what it is that you're doing, so that you have short-term goals, so you can sort of see how you are. Our memories are not very good at these things, much too convenient. Oh yeah, I walked 6 miles. Part of this is measuring yourself in terms of money. If you don't want to spend as much as you can, you have to have budgets. I'm hoping that my daughter is listening to the sermon. I don't have a whole lot of comfort in the fact that she might, but a budget is a plan for spending that you actually pay attention to. You develop these plans and then you actually pay attention to them, and you don't do something because of the budget. And these are the terribly specific, and almost so specific that they are offensive in how we change ourselves into the future. The habits that somehow make room for God. Changes in our life. I have another terribly specific habit that I'd like you to change next year, and that is I'd like you to start eating on a 10-inch plate. These are the plates that most of you have, and this is a 10-inch plate. There's a guy at Cornell that has asked people to use 10-inch plates, and instead of the larger plates that you all use probably, and he discovered that just by using the 10-inch plate, you put a little less on, you eat a little less, and statistically you lose 18 pounds in a year. Average, 18 pounds, just by using the 10-inch plate. Not that any of us ought to lose any weight. But what this does is it sort of reframes everything. It changes how it looks. By the way, you can't go to a 9-inch plate. This is also true. You can't go to a 9-inch plate because then you go, somebody's tricking me here, and you go for seconds. Really, I'm not making this up. You go to Wikipedia, you'll figure this out. And at the 9-inch point, we go, no. But at the 10-inch, we take one serving, we're happy, we're satisfied. Which is what John the Baptist eventually gets to. He says to the soldiers, be satisfied with your wages. And what this does is this picks it's a smaller frame of reference. It's a smaller idea of what it is we're supposed to be doing. It's a smaller sort of habit. It's a whole different way of looking at what sufficiency is. A whole different way of looking at what will make us satisfied. Oh, there's a whole plate full of food there. Oh my gosh, that ought to fill me up. I can measure myself against my father in terms of how much I make. And I'll feel pretty good, because my dad was a mid-level executive at a utility company, but I probably make more than he did when he was alive. Or I could measure myself against my son, who works for Google, and makes more than I ever will. More than Abby and I together ever will. And so we sort of choose in this measurement business, this business of picking our frame of reference, the habits that frame us, who we shall compare ourselves to. Habits rule the world. They're a way of making our life easy, but it's not always about easy. I think we should all change a lot of our habits, don't get me wrong, but I would like to move it one step further. I'm going to stop being John the Baptist for a second, stop talking about 10-inch plates. And I'm going to talk about heaven. In the best of all human worlds, I think there are no habits. No habits. We do everything as if it's the first time. That every event captures us, that the whole world becomes somehow so holy that doing it the same way doesn't even make sense anymore. Our world becomes holy when everything has meaning, and every note is somehow now mystical and magical, and everything is like we are doing it for the first time. And the world has become made new, God says in Revelation, behold, I make all things new. And that somehow, in the best of all possible worlds, we live even beyond our habits, beyond the measurements, beyond the recipes, into something that we discover at each moment when we find out how fresh the kale is today. And that these are the things that God calls us to, the immediacy of caring and loving, into looking at some person's eyes that we had heretofore looked down when we got too close, looking at someone completely new, that the habits that we use to the people that we live with suddenly get changed when we break through the habits and find God's peace in this dramatic new fashion, this new light that breaks into the world, that changes everything, and that our habits are no longer even relevant, that sharing is not something that we need to decide to do. Sharing is something that happens when we look into someone's eyes. But we're not always in that place, my friends. We're not always that ready for God. So John the Baptist brings us the halfway measures, the measures that get us ready, and those are 10-inch plates, and those are treating other people, and those are making room in our lives for that moment in which we might have this magic, that moment when we might have this Magnificat, this moment when we might cry out in joy that God has arrived in our lives in some unimaginable, non-habit-forming way. We may not be as productive when we do this. But God's joy will be